In March 1898, the respected explorer and archaeologist Victor Loret excavated the sacred necropolis known as the Valley of the Kings in the Egyptian city of Thebes. Little did he know then that he would stumble upon a discovery that would echo right up to the present day. Loret discovered something that had been hidden for centuries. In a small tomb tucked deep within the crumbling remains of an ancient structure, he unearths the remains of a pharaoh whom many link directly to the ruler of Egypt during the biblical Exodus. Many consider the writings in the Bible to be a sacred compilation of knowledge bestowed upon man by God, spanning thousands of years. Not only do they provide spiritual guidance, but they also contain interesting historical references to the most influential kingdoms of that era. Among these, one in particular is often mentioned, Mizraim, known to us today as Egypt. In the Bible, we find numerous references to Egyptian rulers, some of whom we can link to real-life pharaohs. One such example is Shishak, who is mentioned in the Book of Kings and in Chronicles as the ruler who invaded Jerusalem, sacked the city, and carried off the treasures from the temple around the 10th century BC. Another pharaoh mentioned in the Bible is Tirhakah. His name occurs in several places in the Book of Kings and in Isaiah. Researchers believe that this is the actual historical figure of Taharka, a Nubian king and pharaoh of the 25th dynasty of Egypt who ruled in the 7th century BC. Yet many biblical texts refer to Egyptian rulers simply as pharaohs without giving specific names, a fact that continues to generate controversy and questions among theologians and historians even today. One of these so-called Egyptian rulers mentioned in the Bible remains at the center of an ongoing controversy in which scholars and researchers are trying to determine exactly who the pharaoh was at the time of the Exodus. To better understand the nature of this debate, we must first go back to the burning sands of ancient Egypt, thousands of years before our era. According to the biblical account, the patriarch Moses kills an Egyptian and flees to Midian to save himself from the wrath of Pharaoh. In this desert area south of Judea, he lives with a priest named Jethro and later marries his daughter Sephora. But before he leaves, life in Egypt is not peaceful at all. During that period, the Jewish people living in Egypt were under severe oppression and experiencing immeasurable suffering. The unnamed pharaoh who ruled at that time feared the growing numbers and power of the Jewish people, so he enslaved them and forced them to work on large-scale construction projects, building cities, roads, and other infrastructure. It was a time of persecution that knew no bounds. One of his cruelest acts was the issuing of an order which stated that all newborn boys of Jewish descent were to be eliminated. It was at this time that Moses was born. Fortunately for the future prophet, his mother was able to hide him, but that was not the reality for most families who were faced with watching their children perish at the hands of cruel authority. During his quiet life in Midian, according to the Bible, Moses was called by God. He had a mystical experience at the burning bush on Mount Sinai, where he received a divine command to return to Egypt, free the Jewish people, and lead them to the promised land. Pharaoh initially rejected his requests, but after a series of devastating plagues and droughts, he eventually allowed Moses to lead his people to the promised land. It was on this road to freedom, at Sinai, that Moses received the 10 Commandments. The identity of the so-called Pharaoh of the Exodus, who enslaved, attacked, and even massacred the Jewish people, has remained somewhat of a mystery throughout most of history. However, the 14th century BC has emerged as a key period in our understanding of the events of the Exodus, as biblical scholars agree that it was then that this watershed moment took place. This sets an important context, as some of the most recognizable Egyptian pharaohs lived during this period. Ancient authors such as the Egyptian priest Manetho and the Roman Jewish historian Josephus Flavius refer to the pharaoh of Exodus by the name Amenophis, the Greek equivalent of the Egyptian Amenhotep, a name borne by several rulers of a well-known dynasty. Through a combination of archaeological finds, inscriptions, and historical sources such as Manetho's Egyptica, scholars have been able to reconstruct a list of Egypt's kings that stretches back to the earliest days of the kingdom. Using this information, researchers have determined that Amenhotep II lived at the same time as Moses, and perhaps as the pharaoh of the Exodus mentioned in the Bible. several interpretations of the Holy Scriptures, including commentaries on the books of Kings, Judges, and Chronicles, have been used to support the claim that Amenhotep II was in fact the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Some scholars believe that the biblical chronology of the era synchronizes perfectly with Egyptian history, placing the Exodus in 1436 BC, which was during the reign of Amenhotep II. But this theory cannot be fully legitimized, since we have only the legends and fragmentary historical accounts of Amenhotep II. Furthermore, there is no definitive proof of this pharaoh's existence until the spring of 1898. Then, archaeologist Victor Loret went deep into the sacred necropolis of Thebes and made a discovery that changed the course of history. As he and his team methodically explored the crumbling tombs of the Valley of the Kings, they came upon the burial chamber of Amenhotep II himself. The amazing thing about this case was that the pharaoh's mummy still lay in its original sarcophagus, something extremely rare, as most tombs were looted centuries before archaeologists ever discovered them. Upon entering the tomb, later named Cave Fit 35, Victor Loret immediately came across a funerary figurine bearing the name Amenhotep II, which allowed him to easily identify the mummy in the sarcophagus. But next to it were the remains of a young boy, identified as the king's son. According to Professor Joel Kramer, his head was shaved except for one spot on the right, from which emerged a magnificent black braid, the so-called prince's braid, characteristic of children of royal descent. Even more impressively, an additional funerary artifact was discovered containing the name Webensenu, the son of Amenhotep II. If we turn to the book of Exodus, chapter 12, there we read, "The Lord smote all the firstborn in Egypt, including the firstborn son of Pharaoh, who sat on the throne." According to Kramer, it was Webinson who died before his father, a fact that is confirmed by the fact that both were buried in the same tomb. But this is not the only connection between Amenhotep II and the Pharaoh of the Exodus. In Exodus, chapter 9, verse 10, an epidemic of festering boils plagues the Egyptians as a punishment from God to the Hebrews. Kramer points out that Amenhotep II is the only king of the Valley of the Kings whose mummy shows signs of skin abscesses resembling those described in Scripture, further reinforcing the theory that he was the one who ruled during the Exodus. And so only one question remains. Did Loret really discover the remains of the Pharaoh of Exodus in Egypt over a century ago? Today, a growing number of biblical scholars and archaeologists agree that there is sufficient evidence to make a convincing connection between the deceased ruler and the Pharaoh described in the biblical account of the Exodus. The discovery of the tomb of Amenhotep II in the ruins of the necropolis in the Valley of the Kings remains one of the most significant discoveries of the last few centuries. Its historical significance is immense, but its dissemination as such is slowly passing into neglect and oblivion. Nonetheless, as archaeology continues to work and uncover forgotten details of this momentous discovery, the ancient burial at Thebes may contain more highly sought-after answers that have remained buried in the sands of Egypt for thousands of years. Just as happened a few days ago with the structures discovered beneath the pyramids of Giza. The possible depth to which these hidden structures reach is 2 kilometers below the pyramids. You can learn more about this amazing discovery in the video you see on the left.